I have been a doctor for 43 years, and I have learned that the most important things a man observes in his life are rarely the things he thinks to write down at the time. I did not write down, in the autumn of 1883, that a Norwegian widow had arrived on a land claim half a mile west of Harwich settlement and had begun, with her 3 children and a set of her dead husband's tools, to cut the earth into bricks. I did not write it down because it did not seem at the time like something that required documentation. There were always new arrivals. There was always building. The frontier in those years was one long act of construction, most of it hopeful, some of it sound, and a great deal of it neither. What I wrote in my journal that autumn, I have it still, a brown leather book with a water stain on the cover that I acquired during my first winter in Minnesota Territory, was the temperature, the condition of 3 patients with influenza, a note about the inadequacy of my supply of carbolic acid, and the observation that the Henderson family's new frame house had developed a gap along the north wall that would need addressing before January. I did not write about Marta Halverson. I am writing about her now. It is March of 1921, and outside my office window the fields are beginning to soften at the edges where the snow has pulled back from the furrows, and the smell coming through the gap in the casement is the smell of thawed earth. Dark, complicated, faintly mineral. The smell that arrives every spring and means the same thing it has always meant, that we have come through another one. 3 weeks ago, Lars Halverson came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon. He is 50 years old now, an architect in Redwood Falls, a large, quiet man with his mother's habit of considering a question fully before he answers it. He set a notebook on my desk without explanation. The cover was water-damaged, and the pages were warped at the corners from years of handling. Inside, in a careful hand I did not recognize, were drawings, elevations, cross-sections, calculations in columns, for a house. Beside the drawings, in a different hand, in Norwegian, were annotations, corrections and additions, and small diagrams drawn in the margins with a carpenter's precision. I looked at the drawings for a long time. Lars sat across from me and did not speak, which is something he does well. "Someone should write down what actually happened," he said finally, "before the people who were there are gone." He left the notebook with me. I have been writing since that evening, and I find that I remember more than I expected, more than I wrote down in 1883, more than I understood at the time. Memory is a strange instrument. It preserves what it preserves according to principles that are not always clear until much later, when you can see what turned out to matter. What turned out to matter in the winter of 1887 going into 1888 was a house. The house that a woman nobody had asked for an opinion built alone on the Minnesota prairie in a way that nobody in Harwich had seen before, and most of them found somewhere between peculiar and offensive. The house that kept 71 people alive. But I am beginning at the wrong end. Let me begin where Lars told me to begin, which is at the beginning. The land around Harwich settlement in 1883 was the kind of land that looked, in spring and summer, like a promise. The grass came in long and thick from the river bottomland, and the soil beneath it was black and deep, and a man standing on the slight rise north of town could turn in a full circle and see nothing to discourage him, no mountains to block passage, no forest to clear, no stone outcroppings to work around. Just the open country running flat to every horizon, and above it the sky, which was larger here than anywhere I had previously lived, a fact that took some adjustment. What that same view looked like in January was a different matter entirely. The settlers who came to Minnesota Territory in the late 1870s and early 1880s arrived with the information that the soil was exceptional, which was true, and with the assumption that the winters, while cold, were manageable with proper preparation, which was partially true in the way that most dangerous things are partially true. The winters were cold. They were also, in the years that tested us most severely, something beyond what the word cold is built to describe. They were an alteration of the world, They were a renegotiation of the terms under which a human body could be expected to continue operating. We built for winter the way we understood winter, which is to say we built for the winters we had already survived. The frame houses that went up across Harwick's settlement between 1878 and 1885 were built of sawn lumber, which had to be hauled in at considerable expense, and they were built in the American fashion. Walls of single-thickness board, gaps chinked with newspaper and rags, stoves that burned through cord wood at a rate that required constant resupply. They were not negligent structures. The men who built them were not fools. They were structures designed by people who knew cold the way you know something you have lived with for a few years, rather than the way you know something that has tried more than once to kill you. I lived in a frame house myself. I knew the sound a well-built frame house makes in sustained cold, the ticking and popping of boards contracting, the whistle through a gap that appeared overnight where no gap had been the evening before, the particular quality of a room that is being heated from one point and losing warmth from all the others simultaneously, so that your back is warm and your face is not, and the floor near the door is a different country from the floor near the stove. I thought this was simply what winter was. I thought everyone who lived through hard winters knew this feeling. I was wrong about that. Marta Halverson arrived in Harwick Settlement on the 14th of April, 1883, in the back of a wagon belonging to a man named Gruber, who hauled freight between New Ulm and the outlying settlements. She had 3 children with her, Lars, 12 years old, and already looking at the landscape with a surveyor's eye. Astrid, 9, who held her brother's hand and watched everything without speaking, and Johann, 5, who had fallen asleep against his mother's arm and was transferred to the wagon bed without waking. She had, in addition to the children, a trunk of household goods, a smaller box of tools wrapped in oilcloth, and a worn leather notebook that she kept throughout the journey from the landing stage at New Ulm in the interior pocket of her coat. Gruber, who told me this later, said she did not speak much during the 2 days of travel, but when she did speak, it was to ask specific questions about the clay content of the bottomland soil, about the location of limestone deposits, about whether the creek that ran along the northern boundary of the quarter sections to the west ran year-round or dried in summer. Didn't ask about neighbors, Gruber said. Didn't ask about the town, didn't ask about the church, asked about limestone. He said this with the tone of a man reporting mild evidence of instability, the tone that Marta Halverson would become accustomed to hearing in Harwick for the next 4 years. What Gruber did not know, and what I know now because Lars told me, and because I have read the notebook, Eric's notebook, which became Marta's notebook, which is now sitting on my desk as I write, is that limestone was the key to the mortar. Not store-bought mortar, not the mortar mixed from bagged lime that the hardware supply in New Ulm sold at prices that made a widow with $23 in her coat pocket do arithmetic in her head. Mortar burned from raw limestone that she would collect from a glacial deposit she had already identified on the land survey, burned in a kiln she would build herself from fieldstone, slaked with water and mixed with clean sand to a formula that her father had written in the front pages of the notebook 40 years earlier in Telemark, Norway, in a hand so precise it looked like print. She had done her planning long before she arrived. That was the first thing I came to understand about Marta Halverson. She was not improvising. She had been preparing on paper and in her mind since before the ship left Christiania. The land she was arriving at was land she had already built on, in her imagination, in a language of calculations and cross-sections and material lists. She was not coming to begin. She was coming to execute. Her husband, Eric, had died of typhoid fever 11 days before the ship reached New York Harbor. He was 36 years old, a carpenter's son from Telemark who had spent a year planning a crossing his wife had suggested and designing a house his wife had outlined and making notes in a leather notebook his wife had given him for the purpose. He did not arrive to build it. She did not turn back. There was nothing to turn back to. The farm in Telemark had been sold, the money spent on passage, and the land filing fee. She continued. She completed the crossing with 3 children and her husband's tools and his notebook, and the knowledge that she had helped her father build 5 structures before she turned 14, and that she understood, in her hands and in her bones, what the notebook contained. At the land office in New Ulm, the agent processing her claim assumed there was a husband expected to follow. The correction was made twice before it took. The community of Harwick Settlement in 1883 was made up of 31 families, predominantly German and Scandinavian, with a smaller number of families from Ohio and Indiana who had come looking for the second chance that the frontier held out in those years like a promissory note. It was, by frontier standards, a settled and functional community. There was a general store run by a man named Carver, a Methodist church with a reasonably weatherproof roof, a school that held classes 5 days a week when the weather allowed, and a social infrastructure maintained largely by the women, which meant largely by Agnes Burwell. Agnes Burwell was the wife of the largest landholder in Harwick, a Vermont-born woman of 52 who had crossed into Minnesota territory by wagon in 1868 and had spent 15 years building a community out of the raw materials that the frontier supplied, which were mostly people who were frightened and needed to feel that there were rules. She was not a cruel woman. She was, in many respects, a generous and capable one. She organized the welcome committees for new arrivals, the bee for raising the schoolhouse roof, the collection for the Kessler family when their wagon lost a wheel crossing the river. She knew everyone's business and most of their troubles, and she helped where helping was within her definition of what help looked like. When Marta Halverson arrived, Agnes sent the welcome committee. They came on a Thursday, 3 women with a Bible, a jar of preserved plums, and a schedule of community events. Marta received them at the door of the temporary dugout she and the children were living in while she planned the construction, thanked them for the plums, accepted the Bible, and asked if any of them knew the location of a limestone outcropping within 10 miles. There was a pause. Mrs. Holst, who was standing nearest the door, said that she believed there might be something of the kind out beyond the Lindqvist claim, but she couldn't say for certain. Marta said that would be very helpful, and thanked her, and the women left. Agnes's assessment delivered to her husband that evening. She was perfectly civil. But she had already decided everything before we arrived. You could see it in her eyes. She was somewhere else entirely. She was. She was already measuring the depression in the northwest corner of her claim, a slight sheltered hollow that most settlers would have avoided as unsuitable for building and that Marta had identified from the survey map as the exact location where a semi-subterranean structure would benefit most from the Earth's own retained warmth. She was thinking about the angle of the winter sun, the direction of the prevailing wind, the depth at which the frost line stabilized, the distance to the creek where she had seen passing in Gruber's wagon a stand of cottonwood sufficient for roof beams. She was building the house before she laid the first brick. She had been building it in some form since a winter evening in Telemark when she was 8 years old, and her father had placed her small hand flat against an interior sod wall and said in Norwegian words that Lars translated for me only last month, "Feel that. That is the summer it remembered. That warmth came in through this wall last July, and has been waiting here for you ever since. If you build the wall thick enough, winter cannot reach in far enough to take it back." She had remembered that her whole life. She had crossed an ocean to prove it. Eric Halverson had been a careful man. This is the first thing you understand when you read his notebook. Not brilliant, not visionary, in the way that word is used to describe people who arrive at ideas no one else has thought of, but careful in the way that a good craftsman is careful, which is to say that he did not proceed to the next step until he was certain of the one he stood on. He had been planning the crossing for 2 years before they left Telemark. He had read everything he could find about Minnesota territory, the land surveys, the agricultural reports, the letters that earlier emigrants had sent back to Norwegian newspapers describing the soil and the seasons and the practical conditions of frontier life. He had corresponded with a man in New Ulm who who had been farming on the Minnesota River since 1875, and who wrote back 2 letters of considerable length, both of which Eric had copied into the notebook in his small, precise hand, with annotations in the margins where the information required correction or qualification. He knew the winters were severe. He knew that the standard American frame construction common to the territory was inadequate for sustained cold below -20. He knew that sod construction was practiced by some homesteaders and that it offered better insulation than frame, but that the standard sod house, walls 18 inches thick, single-layer construction, earthen roof prone to leaking, was an improvement in degree rather than in kind. It kept out more cold than frame. It did not keep out enough. What Eric designed was not a sod house. It was something that had no common name in English because nothing quite like it had been built on the Minnesota prairie before. In Telemark, his wife's father called structures of this type fjellhus, mountain houses, though the term was loose and covered a range of approaches that shared certain principles without being a single defined method. The principles were these: mass absorbs heat and releases it slowly. Earth below the frost line maintains a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. Air, properly managed, insulates better than almost any solid material of equivalent thickness, and a structure that breathes in a controlled fashion will not poison the people inside it, which a structure that does not breathe eventually will. These principles had been understood in Norway for generations. They had been built into the walls of farmhouses in Telemark and Hallingdal and the mountain valleys of Uppland by men and women who had learned through long experience that winter was not a temporary condition to be endured, but a permanent feature of the world to be accommodated. The knowledge was not written in engineering manuals. It was in the hands of builders and in the memories of the people who had lived inside what those builders made. Eric wrote it down. He made drawings. He calculated wall thicknesses and foundation depths and roof slopes. He noted the materials he expected to find available on the Minnesota prairie and worked out substitutions for those he would not find. Cottonwood instead of pine for the roof beams, fieldstone burned for lime instead of the quarried limestone available in Norway, prairie grass bound with clay as a supplementary insulating layer between the inner and outer wall courses. He did not finish the calculations. He died 11 days out of Christiania with 37 pages of notes and a set of preliminary drawings that were complete in concept and incomplete in detail. Marta finished them. She had 8 weeks at sea and she used them. I have spent considerable time with that notebook since Lars placed it on my desk. I am a man of science, or consider myself one, insofar as a frontier doctor with a 20-year-old medical education and a supply of instruments that would make a city physician wince can be said to practice science. And what strikes me most forcefully about the notebook is not the sophistication of the ideas it contains, though they are sophisticated, but the quality of the thinking that connects them. It is systematic thinking. It is the thinking of someone who begins with a problem and works through it step by step, testing each proposed solution against the next problem it creates until arriving at a design that accounts for the whole. Most people, when they think about keeping warm, think about heat. They think about fires and stoves and the question of how much fuel is required to maintain a comfortable temperature in a given space. They think, in other words, about the supply side of the equation. Marta Halverson, and Eric before her, and Knut Vesterheim before him, thought about the loss side. They thought about where warmth goes when it leaves, and how to slow that leaving, and what materials and configurations most effectively create resistance between the warmth inside and the cold outside. This is a different question. It leads to different answers. The answer they arrived at had 4 components that work together as a system. First, sink the building. Dig down 3 feet before you lay the first brick so that the lower portion of your walls are in contact with earth that never drops below 40 degrees, drawing stable warmth upward through the floor regardless of what the air above is doing. Second, Build the walls in 3 distinct layers with a managed air gap between the inner and outer courses, so that the cold must defeat 3 separate barriers rather than one, and so that the still air trapped between the layers acts as an additional insulator. Third, connect the house to the barn by a covered tunnel so that the body heat of the animals, 2 milk cows and a horse in Marta's case, producing between them the thermal equivalent of several additional fires, contributes to the warmth of the whole. Fourth, ventilate deliberately. Build small regulated openings into the walls, plugged with fitted clay stoppers that can be adjusted so that the air inside the house can be refreshed without being replaced wholesale by cold outside air. This last element is the one that surprises people most when I explain it. The intuition is that a house should be as sealed as possible against winter. Marta understood that a completely sealed house is a house where the air goes bad, where the fire and the breathing of the people inside gradually consume the oxygen and replace it with gases that make people sluggish and headachy and eventually sick. She had seen this in Norway, in houses that were too tightly shut against the mountain winters. The clay ventilation plugs were not an oversight in her insulation plan. They were a deliberate and considered part of it. Controlled air, she wrote in Eric's notebook, in Norwegian, in the margin beside his ventilation drawing. Not sealed, not open. Controlled. 2 words. But they represented a level of thinking about building science that I, a trained physician, did not bring to the question of winter shelter until Marta's house had demonstrated it to me over 3 successive winters. She began in May of 1883, after the ground had thawed sufficiently to work. The first thing she built was not the house. It was a kiln, a small fieldstone structure 12 feet from the building site, constructed in 2 days, with Lars carrying stone from a draw half a mile east, where glacial deposits had left a useful scatter of flat-faced limestone. She burned the limestone in the kiln over 3 days, feeding the fire with dead cottonwood from the creek bottom, and slaked the resulting quicklime with water carried in buckets by both Lars and Astrid, producing a lime paste that she mixed with clean sand from the creek bank in the proportions her father had specified and she had verified in the notebook. The mortar she produced was better than what Carver's General Store sold in bags hauled from New Ulm. It was denser, less porous, and it bonded to the sod brick with an adhesion that I later observed, after a hard freeze and thaw cycle, to be more reliable than the commercial product used in the frame buildings around it. This was not accidental. The formula had been tested over generations in conditions at least as demanding as Minnesota Territory. She built a test wall next, 12 feet long, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2.5 feet at the top, constructed from the first sod bricks she cut from the northeast corner of her claim where the grass was densest and the root mat toughest. A breaking plow borrowed from the Lindqvist claim. Nora Lindqvist, the Swedish widow who farmed half a mile to the east, had offered it with the straightforward practicality of one woman who understood what another woman needed. Cut the bricks in uniform pieces 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. Each brick weighed, by my later estimate, between 40 and 50 pounds. Astrid and Lars stacked them beside the building site in courses by height, so that Marta could reach for a brick of the right dimension without looking away from the wall she was building. Johan, 5 years old, spent these days tethered to a stake by a length of rope long enough to let him reach the water bucket and short enough to keep him from the creek. He accepted this arrangement with the philosophical patience of a child who has learned that his mother's decisions are not subject to negotiation. The test wall stood alone on the claim through the summer of 1883, receiving the sun and the rain and the drying wind of the prairie and the first frosts of early October. Marta examined it weekly. She pressed her palms flat against the interior face and noted the temperature differential between the surface and the ambient air. She checked for settling, for moisture intrusion, for cracking at the mortar joints. She found the mortar in the lower courses, where she had mixed a batch with slightly too little sand, beginning to powder at the edges by August, and she rebuilt that section with an adjusted formula, and the rebuilt section held clean through October and into November, when the ground began to harden and she stopped work for the season. During this time, she also excavated the building site. 3 feet down across the full footprint of the planned structure, 80 feet long, 30 feet wide. A task that she, Lars, and Astrid accomplished over 6 weeks with 2 spades and a mattock, piling the removed earth to the north side of the site where it would later be used for banking. It is worth pausing on what this means physically. The excavation alone represented the removal of something in the range of 7,000 cubic feet of Minnesota clay and topsoil, by hand, by a woman and 2 children. Lars was 12, Astrid was 9. They worked in the mornings before the heat of the day, and on evenings when the light held, and on Saturdays. Lars told me, when I asked him about this time, that he did not experience it as hardship exactly, that it had the quality of ordinary life, of simply what they did, the way farm children of that era simply did what farm life required. But he also said that by the end of the excavation, his hands had changed, that he could feel, in the calluses on his palms and the thickened skin of his fingers, the weight of every shovel load of that excavation. I understood, he said, that we were building something real, not because someone told me, because I felt it in my hands. The people of Harwick Settlement watched this activity with a mixture of responses that shifted over the course of that first summer, from curiosity to bemusement to the particular discomfort that communities feel when someone among them is doing something that does not fit any available category. A Norwegian widow alone on a claim was not, in itself, unusual. Widows homesteaded. Women managed farms. The frontier was not sentimental about the division of labor when survival required otherwise. What was unusual was the nature of what Marta was building. The excavation alone drew comment. Digging herself in, people said, a phrase that carried implications its speakers may not have fully intended. When the test wall appeared on the claim, standing in isolation without any visible relationship to a completed structure, the comments shifted towards something more pointed. Carver, who ran the general store and whose opinion on most subjects was delivered freely and received as authoritative, told a customer in August that he had ridden past the Halverson claim and seen what she was building, and that in his view the woman was either planning to keep livestock in her own house or she had not fully understood what she had filed on. He said this without particular malice. It was the considered judgment of a man who knew what a house was supposed to look like and had observed something that did not look like it. Agnes Burwell said less and thought more. She made a point of driving past the claim one evening in late September, ostensibly to call on the Lindqvist family, and she sat in her wagon for several minutes looking at the excavated site, the raw wound of it, the displaced earth piled high to the north, the test wall standing alone in the failing light like something ancient and unexplained. She told her husband that evening that the Halverson woman was clearly intelligent, but that intelligence without guidance was a different thing from wisdom. The children look healthy, her husband said. They do, Agnes agreed. She did not say anything further on the subject that evening, but I believe it stayed with her. The only person in Harwick who did not comment, to my knowledge, was Nora Lindqvist. Nora had lent the breaking plow without being asked twice. She had brought her eldest son to help Lars clear a section of particularly root-bound sod in July, stayed 2 hours, and left without ceremony. She was not, in 1883, a friend to Marta. She was too careful of her own position in the community's social arrangement for friendship with someone the community was beginning to regard as eccentric. But she was something, a watcher, a woman who kept her judgment in reserve while she gathered information. She would not speak that judgment for 4 more years. When she did, it would cost her something real to say it. The delay cost her something too, though of a different kind. That accounting, what silence costs, what speaking costs, is something I have thought about for a long time in relation to those years. I do not think the balance ever fully settles, but Nora Lindqvist's reckoning belongs to a later part of this account. In the autumn of 1883, she was a woman watching from a distance, lending a plow, and keeping her own counsel. The excavation was complete. The test wall had survived its first season. The mortar formula was confirmed. In the spring of 1884, Marta Halverson would begin to build in earnest. The spring of 1884 came late and wet to Harwick Settlement, which was not unusual, and then turned warm so quickly in the last week of April that the creek ran high with snowmelt for 10 days, and the bottomland to the south of town stayed soft and unworkable well into May. The farmers watched the sky and calculated their planting windows and worried, as farmers on the Minnesota prairie always worried, about the margin between a good season and a failed one. The margin was narrow. It was always narrow. That narrowness was simply a condition of the life they had chosen, or that had chosen them, depending on how a man felt about the question of agency in relation to the frontier. Marta Halverson did not plant in the spring of 1884. She had broken a section of ground the previous autumn for a kitchen garden, enough to supplement what the root cellar held and what she could purchase in small quantities from Carver's store. But the main labor of that spring, and of the summer that followed, was the house. She began with the foundation courses. The first 3 layers of sod brick laid below the level of the surrounding ground, in the excavated bed that had been waiting since autumn. Below-grade work is different from above-grade work in ways that are both practical and psychological. You cannot stand back and see what you are making. You are working in a hole, and the hole defines your horizon, and what you are building does not yet look like anything except more hole. Lars told me that this was the phase he found most difficult to sustain, not physically, though the work was physical, but in terms of faith in the outcome. He could not see the house from inside the excavation. He could only see the next brick and the one before it. "Your mother," I asked him. "Did she have difficulty with that?" He thought about this for a moment in the way he thinks about questions, which is completely and without apology for the time it takes. "No," he said. "She already knew what it would look like. She had been looking at it for 2 years." The first real difficulty came in June. The inner and outer wall courses were rising simultaneously, Marta laying the outer course from one side of the trench, while Lars managed the inner course from the other, both courses following the same plumb line, both courses tied together at intervals with a through brick that crossed the full wall thickness and locked the 2 faces into a single structure. Between the 2 courses ran the air gap, 4 inches of still space that would, when the wall was complete and plastered on the interior face, act as an additional barrier against cold transfer. The difficulty was the mortar in the through bricks. Where a through brick crossed the air gap, it bridged the insulating space and created a path for cold to conduct from the outer face to the inner. What a civil engineer would later tell me is called a thermal bridge. Marta had identified this problem in the notebook, in a marginal note that I believe she wrote during the Atlantic crossing, and she had proposed a solution. Coat each through brick on both exposed faces within the air gap with a thick application of lime mortar mixed with a higher proportion of grass fiber, creating a layer of lower thermal conductivity at the bridge point. This is the kind of detail that does not appear in any construction guide I have ever read, and that I would not have thought to consider. It is also, as I understand it in retrospect, the difference between a wall system that performs as designed and one that develops cold spots at regular intervals along its length, cold spots that would, over a winter, produce the interior condensation and eventual deterioration that plagued many sod structures on the prairie. The difficulty in June was this: the grass fiber was the wrong grass. She had been using the cut ends from the sod bricks themselves, short root fragments that remained after the brick was cut and turned. These were plentiful and required no additional harvesting. But they were also relatively coarse and brittle, and when she tested a mortar sample made with this fiber against a sample made with the longer, finer grass she had gathered from the creek margin, the difference in flexibility was apparent. The creek margin grass bound the mortar without making it rigid. The root fragments made a mortar that was strong when dry, but that showed fine cracks after a wet-dry cycle. She pulled the through bricks she had laid in the first two courses and relaid them with the correct mortar. This cost 4 days. She did not comment on it, that I know of. Lars does not remember her expressing frustration. What he remembers is that she spent an evening at the table with the notebook open, working through the calculation of how the delay would affect the construction schedule, and that she adjusted the schedule, and that the next morning she was back at the wall at first light. By August, the walls had reached 4 feet above grade, and the structure had become visible from the Harwick Road. This was the moment when the community's response shifted from the slightly amused speculation of the previous year to something with a sharper edge. A sod wall, 4 feet high and 3 feet thick, running 80 feet in one direction and 30 in the other, with a second interior wall already rising inside the first, was not a house by any definition Harwick settlement recognized. It was too large, too low, too much the color of the earth it rose from. Carver revised his opinion. He now thought she was building a storage facility of some kind, perhaps a commercial ice house, though he could not account for why a widow on 160 acres of prairie would need a commercial ice house or how she intended to fill it. He offered this theory to whoever came through his store, which meant to everyone in Harwick, and it spread with the speed of information in a small community that has not yet found the right category for something new. Pastor Thorne came to call on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. He was a conscientious man who visited his congregation's outlying claims regularly, and his visit was not primarily investigative, though I believe he was curious. He stood at the edge of the building site and looked at the walls for a long time, while Marta continued laying bricks, and Lars carried the hod and Astrid packed mortar into the gap between courses with a wooden float she had shaped herself from a split cottonwood branch. Thorne asked about the design. Marta explained it briefly, the way she explained most things, with the minimum of words necessary to answer the question that was actually asked, and no additional elaboration. He asked why the walls were so thick. She said, "Because thick walls remember summer." He appeared to consider this. He asked whether the structure was intended as a dwelling. She said it was. He asked whether it would be finished before winter. She said it would not. They would winter in the temporary dugout again and complete the house the following spring. Thorne said, with the careful tone of a man delivering an opinion he knows may not be welcome, "Mrs. Halverson, the congregation would be glad to assist with the building. We have raised barns in 3 days with enough hands. A house is not so different." Marta set down her trowel and looked at him. "It is different," she said. "A barn does not need to do what this house needs to do, and the men who would come to help would build what they know how to build. I need what I know how to build." She said it without anger. She picked up her trowel and went back to the wall. Thorne rode back to Harwick and told his wife that the Halverson woman was the most self-contained person he had encountered since coming west, and he was not sure whether this was a virtue or a problem. His wife, who was considerably more perceptive than her husband on most questions, said that it was probably both, and that the two were not mutually exclusive. The second winter in the dugout was harder than the first. Not because the dugout was worse. Marta had improved it over the summer, adding a second layer of sod to the exposed north face and re-chinked the doorframe. But because the children were a year older and a year more aware of how their situation read to the outside world. Lars, at 13, was old enough to understand that the comments the other boys made about his family were not simply teasing. Astrid, at 10, had stopped trying to make friends at the settlement school and had turned instead to a private world of observation and small collected things, feathers, interesting stones, the shed skins of grasshoppers, that she kept in a wooden box under her sleeping shelf. Johann, 6 years old, remained largely impervious. He had grown up knowing no other life and had no previous standard to measure against. Marta spent the winter evenings with the notebook. She worked through the calculations for the roof system, the most technically demanding element of the structure, the one where an error in design would not become apparent until the first heavy snow or sustained freeze made the consequences visible. The roof had to accomplish several things simultaneously: shed water reliably, insulate against cold transfer from above, carry the weight of the sod layer that would cover it, and resist the lateral pressure of the wall tops against which it rested. Eric had drafted the basic scheme: cottonwood beams at 3-foot intervals, willow lattice between them, tar paper overlaid with a foot of packed sod. But the beam sizing calculations assumed straight-grained pine of a quality not available on the Minnesota prairie, and cottonwood, which was available, is a different material, heavier, less uniformly grained, requiring larger dimensions to achieve the same load-bearing capacity. She recalculated. She filled 6 pages of the notebook with arithmetic that I have examined and that Lars, who knows more about structural engineering than I do, has confirmed is essentially correct. The house was finished in October of 1885, 2.5 years from the first brick of the test wall to the last application of whitewash on the interior plaster. By any measure, it was complete. The main hall 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, the walls rising to 9 feet at the roof peak, the 2 stone fireplaces drawing cleanly, the connecting tunnel to the barn packed with fresh sod and sound underfoot. The root cellar beneath the main hall stocked with potatoes and turnips and dried fish, and the rendered fat of a hog she had traded 3 weeks' labor to Caleb Burwell's farmhand to obtain. The total cost, by the accounting in the back pages of the notebook, came to $31.40. This included the filing fee, the tar paper, the nails, and the small quantities of materials she had been unable to produce herself. It did not include the labor, which is to say it did not include Marta's hands or Lars's back or Astrid's steady work with the mortar float or the 2.5 years of mornings and evenings that had gone into making the thing exist. What the cost represented in practical terms was this: Marta Halverson had built the most thermally sound structure in Harwick Settlement for less money than most of her neighbors had spent on lumber alone. Nobody knew this yet. Nobody was asking. The winters of 1885 and 1886 were hard. The winter of 1886 into 1887, the winter that ranchers across the northern plains would remember as the Great Die-Up, was catastrophic by any measure that mattered. Cattle died in the hundreds of thousands from the Dakotas to the Montana Territory. In Harwick, Caleb Burwell lost 60% of his herd. The Hendersons lost their milk cows. 3 families burned their furniture before February. In the Halverson house, the fireplaces burned a modest and consistent quantity of cottonwood. The root cellar provided. The tunnel kept the animals alive, and their warmth moved through the walls of the passage into the walls of the house, and the walls gave it back slowly, the way Knut Vesterheim had said they would, the way Marta had calculated they would, the way no one in Harwick Settlement had believed they could. Aldrich, meaning myself, at 33, still capable of surprise, rode out to the Halverson claim in January of 1887 on a day when the temperature stood at -26. I had been making rounds of the outlying families, checking on the children particularly, watching for the signs of sustained cold exposure that I had learned to recognize in the previous 2 winters. I knocked at the Halverson door. Marta opened it, and the air that came out was warm. Not warm the way a room feels when a stove is working hard to compensate for cold pouring through the walls. Warm the way a room feels when the cold has simply not gotten in. Warm the way that, I found myself thinking, without understanding why I thought it, a room feels in October. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. "Come in," Marta said. "You are letting the cold in." I came in. She closed the door. I stood in the main hall and looked at the small fire burning in the nearer of the 2 stone fireplaces. Small, measured. A fire that was maintaining something rather than fighting something. And I looked at the walls, and I looked at the ceiling, and I looked at the 3 children who were sitting around the table in their ordinary indoor clothes, not their coats, not their blankets, just their clothes, doing the ordinary things that children do on a winter evening. I took my hat off. I held it in my hands. I stayed 2 hours that evening, asking questions that Marta answered in her brief and sufficient way, and I rode home in the dark and the cold, and I wrote in my journal, 51 degrees inside. External temperature -26. Fire modest and not recently stoked. I do not have an adequate explanation for this. I intend to return. I also wrote, and I am not proud of this, but I wrote it, and it is in the journal, and Lars is entitled to know it. Why did I not ask her about this 2 years ago? The question had no good answer. I had ridden past that claim 200 times in 2 years. I had observed the structure going up, noted its unusual dimensions, formed no particular conclusion, and continued on my rounds. It had not occurred to me to stop and ask the woman what she was building and why she was building it that way, and what she knew that the rest of us did not. She was a widow, she was foreign, she was building something strange, and I was a man of science who had, for 2 years, failed to be curious about the most scientifically interesting structure in the county. The autumn of 1887 was the autumn that Marta told Lars the earth smelled different. He was 16 by then, old enough to be her equal in the heaviest work, old enough to notice what she noticed. He asked her what she meant. She said the cold was coming differently that year, not in the ordinary way, the settling cold that came gradually as December deepened, but in a way that felt to her like something that had been held back and was preparing to arrive all at once. She had felt this once before, she told him, in Norway, when she was 12. The year a storm came down from the Arctic that the old people in the valley had not seen in their lifetimes. The year the ground froze so deep it split the stone walls of the oldest farmhouses. She doubled the firewood. She expanded the root cellar by 8 feet to the east. She repacked the tunnel with fresh sod and checked every joint in the roof beams. She added 2 additional clay ventilation plugs to the north wall and made certain their stoppers fit without play. Lars helped with all of it without being told the full reason. He understood enough by then to know that when his mother prepared, there was something to prepare for. He also understood, though he was 16 and could not have articulated it in these terms, that the preparing was itself the point, that the house his mother had built was not a finished thing, but an ongoing argument with winter, an argument that required constant attention and adjustment and the willingness to take seriously what other people had not yet found reason to fear. December came, then Christmas, then the 26th, when the temperature dropped and did not rise. The long cold had begun. I will tell you what the long cold felt like from the inside of it, which is to say from the inside of my rounds, 14 households in the first week, then 18 as I began checking on families I had not initially worried about, then every household in Harwick settlement by the end of the second week, because by then I was worried about all of them. The cold arrived on December 26th as a settling, a deepening of the ordinary winter cold that did not feel, on that first day, like anything more than a hard stretch of weather. We had hard stretches. Every winter gave us at least one. A man learned to read them as temporary, to keep the fire stoked and wait for the break. And the break came. That was the pattern. That was what experience taught. The pattern did not hold. By the 4th day, the temperature had not risen above -18. The Henderson family had burned through 1/3 of their remaining cord wood. I noted this in my journal and wrote beside it, "Accelerated consumption. Advise resupply." I rode to the next claim. I did not yet understand what I was looking at. By the 7th day, I understood. Not completely. I do not think any of us understood completely until it was over and we could count what it had cost. But enough. The cold was not a stretch of weather. It was a new condition. It was what the air in Harwick settlement had decided to be, for reasons that had nothing to do with our preferences or our preparations or the confidence with which we had built our frame houses and stacked our cordwood and told ourselves we were ready. I began riding to the Halverson claim every morning before I started my rounds. I told myself this was medical practice, that the data point of a functioning household would help me calibrate what I was seeing elsewhere. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I rode to the Halverson claim every morning because standing inside that house for 20 minutes before I began the day's work was the only thing that kept me from a despair that would not have served my patience. The house was the same every morning, 50 degrees, the small fire, measured and steady, the 3 children in their ordinary clothes, Marta at the table with coffee, or at the wall with whatever task the day required. The sound inside the house was a particular quietness, not silence, because there is always sound where people live, but a quietness that came from the absence of the sounds that filled every other dwelling I entered that month. The sounds of a building in distress, the ticking of contracting boards, the whistle through gaps, the particular effortful roar of a stove working at its maximum capacity and losing ground. Those sounds were not in Marta's house. The walls absorbed the wind and returned nothing. The cold pressed against 3 feet of packed earth and grass and lime mortar and found no purchase and moved on. On the 9th day I asked her if I could sit for an hour and make notes. She said yes and poured me a second cup of coffee and went back to her work. I sat and wrote. The temperature, the quality of the light through the south-facing window, the sound of the fire, the way the warmth in the room was not concentrated near the fireplace, but distributed, present at the floor, present at the walls, present in the air at shoulder height, not stratified the way warmth stratifies, in a thin-walled room where the heat rises immediately to the ceiling and the floor stays cold. The walls were radiating. They had absorbed weeks of fire warmth and were giving it back into the room from every surface simultaneously, the way Knut Vesterheim had said they would, the way Marta had calculated they would, the way I was only now, on the 9th day of the long cold, fully believing they could. I asked her to show me the ventilation plugs. She took me to the north wall and pulled one of the clay stoppers, a fitted cylinder about 2 inches across, from its opening and held a candle near the hole. The flame bent. Outside air moving in, slowly in a thin, controlled stream, carrying fresh cold with it that the mass of the warm walls would absorb and temper before it reached the room's center. She replaced the stopper. The flame straightened. Controlled, she said, which is what she had written in the notebook's margin years before, and which required no further elaboration. I rode out that afternoon to the Jensen claim, where the 2 youngest children had developed coughs from sleeping in a room whose temperature had dropped to 34 degrees overnight. I did what I could. It was not enough. Nothing I carried in my bag was a substitute for warmth. Agnes Burwell came to the Halverson door on the night of January 7th, which was the 12th day of the long cold. Lars told me this. He was 16 and sleeping lightly in the way of adolescent boys who sense that the adults around them are managing something large, and he heard the knock and did not move immediately, and lay still in his bunk and watched through the gap in the partition that divided the sleeping area from the main hall. Agnes stood in the doorway with a child in her arms. Her granddaughter Lily, 8 years old, had been visiting from a neighboring settlement when the cold descended and had been trapped at the Burwell farm for 12 days. The child had developed a fever on the 10th day. Agnes had treated it as she had treated fevers before, with what she had and what she knew, and what she had and what she knew was not enough because the Burwell house was cold. Had been cold since the 8th day when Caleb Burwell, a proud man, had refused to ask his neighbors for additional firewood and had miscalculated what they had in store. The house was losing its battle. The fever was not breaking. Agnes did not say any of this. She stood in the doorway with Lily against her chest, and her face did what Lars said he did not have the right word for. Marta opened the door wider and took the child from Agnes's arms with the practiced motion of a woman who had carried children through the dark more than once. She did not speak about the 4 years. She did not speak about the cold or the house or the name they had called it, or the social machinery that had turned against her family for the better part of her time in Harwick settlement. She carried Lily to the place nearest the fire and knelt and put her palm against the child's forehead. "Come in," she said to Agnes. "Close the door." Agnes came in. She closed the door. Lars watched her stand in the middle of the main hall and look. At the walls, at the ceiling, at the modest fire burning in the stone fireplace, at the warmth that was simply present in the room, the way warmth is present in a place that has been protecting it for a long time. He watched her face move through something that was not one thing and could not be named as one thing. He has told me this twice, and both times he has stopped at that description and not added to it, and I have not pressed him. I arrived the following morning and found Lily sleeping with color returning to her face. I found Agnes asleep in a chair by the fire, still in her outdoor coat. I found Marta in the kitchen area, moving quietly so as not to wake them. I sat down and did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "How many more are in trouble out there?" She said, "Most of them." Over the following 6 days, people came, not all at once and not in a group, but individually, in the way that people arrive at a decision they have been resisting, with a particular mixture of relief and difficulty that is its own distinct emotion and does not simplify into either one. The Hendersons came on the 10th. The Petersons brought their youngest child and then went back for the older ones. Pastor Thorne and his wife arrived on the 13th day. Caleb Burwell himself came at last, on the evening of the 14th, and took Marta's hand at the door without speaking. By the 15th day there were 23 people in the Halverson house. The root cellar fed all of them. The connecting tunnel meant the animals were alive in the barn, and their warmth moved through the passage and added to the whole, as it had been designed to do. The ventilation plugs were adjusted daily by Marta and then by Lars when she showed him how, keeping the air clean and breathable for 23 people without dropping the interior temperature below what the walls could recover. The fireplaces burned at their ordinary measured rate. I slept on the floor of the main hall on the 15th night, among 7 other adults and 11 children, and I woke at 3 in the morning, and the room was 50 degrees, and I lay on my back and looked at the sod ceiling and thought about Eric Halverson, who had died on a ship in the Atlantic at 36 years old, and who had designed the ceiling I was looking at and would never see it. I thought about the notebook sitting in a box in this house for 2.5 years while the community around it decided what to think of the woman who had built from it. The cold broke on January 13th. The temperature rose to -8, which was not warm but was the end of something. People gathered their things and their children and went back to assess what the 19 days had cost them. They went quietly, with the particular quietness of people who are still deciding what to do with what they now knew. The acknowledgments came in the way that true acknowledgments usually come, which is slowly and without the neatness of a formal reckoning. Agnes Burwell came back to the claim 3 days after the cold broke. She came alone, in the morning, and she did not knock at the door but went around to the north wall where the winter had opened a surface crack in the outer sod course. She had brought a bucket. She began working the crack, packing it with the loose material from the bucket, pressing it in with her fingers the way she had watched Marta work mortar the previous summer when she had driven past on the road. Marta came out and looked at her. Agnes looked back. Neither woman said anything about what had happened or why Agnes was there or what it meant. Marta went inside and came back with a second tool, the wooden float that Astrid had made 3 years before from a split cottonwood branch, and handed it to Agnes, and they worked the crack together for 2 hours until it was sealed. Caleb Burwell sent his eldest son the following week with 2 draft horses and the breaking plow, with a note that said only, "For spring, use as needed." Lars accepted the note and the horses and thanked him, and sent back a note that said, "We will." Pastor Thorne came on a Thursday with his notebook, the one he used for sermon preparation, and asked Marta if she would show him how the walls were built. He sat on an upturned bucket in the cold and wrote while she explained. He asked careful questions and listened to the answers. At one point, he put down his pencil and said, without looking at her, "I preached about self-sufficiency once in a way I think was aimed at you. I've been trying to find the right words for that." Marta said, "You have." He looked up. She was already pointing at the next section of wall she wanted to explain. In the spring of 1888, 7 new structures were begun in Harwick Settlement with walls at least 18 inches thick, 3 of them under Marta's direct guidance. The technique moved outward from Harwick the way useful knowledge moves, from one set of hands to another, from one winter's lesson to the next season's building, until it reached settlements that had never heard the name Halverson and would not have attached it to what they were building if they had. In Renville County, they called it the Norwegian Way. Further east, it had no name at all. It was simply the way some people had started to build, the way that kept the cold out, the way that worked. Marta did not pursue the attribution. She pursued the competence of the people she taught, which is a different thing, and in the long run, more durable. She died in April of 1914 in the house she had built, in the chair by the south window that she always opened first when the earth began to warm. Lars found her at noon. The window was open. The smell of thawed ground was coming in, that dark, mineral, complicated smell that means the frost has let go and the earth is itself again. Lars brought me the notebook 7 years later, in March of 1921, on a Tuesday afternoon when the fields outside my office were beginning to show the same signs. He told me that he was still living in the house, that he had added to it twice, once in 1901 and once in 1909, and that both additions were built the same way she had built the original, because he knew no better method and did not expect to find one. He told me that the original walls, after 30 years, had compressed under their own weight to a density closer to stone than to earth, that the mortar joints were tight, that the ventilation system she had built into the north wall was still operational and still necessary and still worked. I asked him what he wanted me to do with the notebook. He said, "Write it down, what actually happened." He said that the version of events that had passed into Harwick's common memory was softer than the truth, that the years of mockery had been smoothed away, that his mother had been made into a figure of uncomplicated heroism, that the long patience of the building and the long coldness of the community's response had been edited out in favor of a simpler story about a woman who was proved right in a crisis. She was proved right, he said, but that is the smallest part of it. I asked him what the largest part was. He thought about it the way he thinks about things. "She built for the winter that hadn't come yet," he said finally. Everyone else built for the winters they already knew. She built for the one that would finally be too much for what they knew. That is not heroism. That is a different way of thinking about time. She thought further ahead. She was willing to pay the cost of thinking further ahead, which is that people who are only thinking about now will not understand what you are doing or why. He picked up the chisel from his coat pocket, the one with the birch handle, the one his grandfather Canute had made in Telemark. He turned it in his hands. "She used this every day she was building," he said. "I use it still. Not because I have to, because it fits my hand the right way." He set it on the desk beside the notebook. He stood up, put on his coat, and shook my hand. I have been writing since that evening. The fields outside are thawed now, fully, and the smell coming through the office window is the smell that Marta opened her window for on the last morning of her life. The smell of earth that has come through another one, that has held its warmth through everything the winter sent against it, that is ready now for the work of another season. She built walls thick enough that the cold never reached the center. I have spent 7 years thinking about whether there is a lesson in that, beyond the architectural one. I find at 68, sitting at this desk with the chisel and the notebook and the March light coming through the window, that I am no longer certain the question is the right question. Marta Halverson would not have asked it. She would have said, "The lesson is in the walls. The walls are the lesson." You want to understand what she knew. You put your hand flat against the interior face in January and you feel what is there, and then you build accordingly, and then you are warm. The notebook is closed on my desk. The chisel is beside it. Outside, the earth is waking.